Last fall, when it was announced that David had received one of those MacArthur Fellowship Genius Grants, a group of people at the Post started emailing one another, sharing their favorite Finkel pieces. Now, David's been at the paper for more than 20 years, so there were quite a few articles to choose from. And what was interesting was that everyone seemed to have a different favorite. There was a story about the gun, the Smith & Wesson 9mm semi-automatic used in a series of well-publicized shootings in Prince George's County in the 1980s. There were the diary-like reports from the border areas around Kosovo in 1999, portraying the plight of refugees who had fled to escape the brutal violence there. There was the Deadline piece in 2004, just after George W. Bush was elected for the second time, about the Leslies, an evangelical family in Ohio, the kind of moral values family on which the Bush campaign had built its re-election strategy. There was the Larry King profile for the Washington Post magazine and another magazine piece about a family that watches TV. There was an article about a kid who plays violent video games and listens to rap, a story on Hooters, another on Rush Limbaugh fans, and the list goes on. Now, notably, this spontaneous list didn't even include the several pieces that David wrote in 2005 on the failed experiment in democracy building in Yemen, which won him a Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting. Nor did it include the series about worldwide patterns of illegal immigration, which earned David a Robert F. Kennedy Journalist Award in 2001. Nor the story about racial and class conflict in Washington, which drew a Missouri Lifestyle Award in 1995. And I've got to stop and catch my breath here. Now, the MacArthur folks described David as, quote, a journalist whose finely honed methods of immersion reporting and empathy for often overlooked lives yield stories that transform readers' understanding of the difficult subjects he depicts. After pushing the bounds of newspaper writing, it was only a matter of time before David would seek to venture beyond and do a book, which he did, resulting 4 years ago in The Good Soldiers. And that gripping account narrated the deployment in Iraq of a U.S. Army Infantry Battalion during the 2007-2008 so-called surge. His new book, Thank You for Your Service, is a sequel to the first. It follows some of the same soldiers and their families in their difficult efforts to resume their lives at home. This is a heartbreaking, haunting tale filled with intimate portraits of ongoing struggles, not just with physical injuries and mental wounds, but with isolation, loneliness, anger, and bewilderment. In a recent interview, David was asked how the writing of this book changed him. He said he's a little sadder, but also more grateful and appreciative of life's pleasures. He also said he thinks of war now, not only intellectually, but viscerally. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming David Finkel.
Hi, everybody. So I think I want to start off by telling you about something that's not in the book, which has to do with the moment that I realized the reporting for this book was done and I was ready to start writing. If you read the book, you're going to meet an Iraq war veteran named Adam Schumann. And at one point, Adam, in his recovery from war, was admitted to a mental health facility in Northern California. And when he was done at the facility, when he was ready to go back to Kansas, he decided to drive back, and I decided, for my reporting reasons, to go along with him and his wife Saskia as they drove straight ahead from Northern California back to Kansas. So their plan was to leave at sundown and drive straight through. So they were in the front seat, I was in the back seat. Take off, true to their word, they keep going. Occasional stops for gasoline, some bottles of water. Otherwise, they just kind of go ahead. And at some point, I don't know, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, somewhere in Utah, nothing around. I got a little drowsy, and I fell asleep. And to give you a sense of what a nice guy Adam Schumann is, he had to pee. And he was afraid if he pulled over, somehow it would wake me up. So he did the old Iraq trick where you just basically pee in a water bottle as you're driving along. Now, the reason I know this, unfortunately, is sometime in the middle of the night I woke up and I was thirsty, and in the back seat I reached around in the dark for my bottle of water, and I took the cap off and I took a big swig. And I remember thinking, I think I'm about done with my reporting now.
Getting too close to your sources.
It's amazing. It was a low moment. That's a charming story. That is that's not in the book. What is in the book are stories of what I call the afterwar, of what is going around us now that the wars over there have ended or about ended, and they've come home to here. The book is about war soldiers, wives of war soldiers, children of war soldiers, widows of war soldiers. It's an emotional book, and it's a book that I hope lives up to what the great author Ben Fountain said of it in a quote for the cover. It'll piss you off and break your heart. I first met Adam Schumann in 2007 during the Iraq War when I was working on the first volume of the story, this book called The Good Soldiers. I was embedded with an infantry battalion called the 216 out of Fort Riley, Kansas for 15 months, this period of the war known as the Surge. And into this presumed lost moment of this war went 800 young men, most of them 19, 20 years old, full of idealism and mission, and into Baghdad. And when they came home 15 months later, well, they had had a rough time of it, and they had been degraded by the experience of what war turned out to be, and they were changed. I was with them, probably 8 months of their 14 and a half months on the ground, and one day during a quiet period, I was asking around for a great soldier to talk to, and a couple people mentioned this guy Adam Schumann, and they said, yeah, he really is one of our best. And a little time went by. And then I reached the point where I was ready to meet the great Adam Schumann, and I found his room, and I went inside. And he was sitting there, and I introduced myself, and he said, so I guess I know why you're here. And I said, well, I want to, I'd like to write about what's going on with you. And he said, well, what's going on with me is I'm going home. I'm leaving. And after 3 combat tours, 1,000 days in combat, acting by everyone's stories terrifically. I mean, he had broken, and he couldn't do it anymore, and he was leaving that day. So I stayed with him until he left, and as I wrote in the first book of his final moments, his stomach hurt as he made his way across the base. He felt himself becoming nauseated. At the landing area, other soldiers from other battalions were lined up, and when the helicopter landed, everyone was allowed to board except him. He didn't understand. Next one's yours, he was told, and when it came in a few minutes later, he realized why he'd had to wait. It had a big red cross on the side. It was the helicopter for the injured and the dead. That was him, Adam Schumann. He was injured, he was dead, he was done. And so he left the war, filled with a sense of shame, not pride over what he had done, but shame that he had to leave early. And, so I wrote about him and some other guys, and the book came out, and I thought I was done with it. But after the book was published, all kinds of people started getting in touch with me and saying, it's not going so well for me. I'm anxious, I'm depressed, I'm not sleeping well. It got worse. There were attempts at suicide. There were all the things we've heard about in all the books that are out there about the effects of war. But it sort of dawned on me that I knew these guys. I had credibility with them. I had written half the story, and the other half ought to be written, and I ought to take a swing at it. That's this book. And this is a book, and what I'd like to do for maybe 15, 20 minutes is read some excerpts and talk about what my approach to the book was. The new book begins again with Adam Schumann. We last saw him in the last book when he was leaving on the helicopter, and here's how the new book begins. 2 years later, Adam drops the baby. The baby, who is 4 days old, is his son, and there is a moment as he is falling that this house he has come home to seems like the most peaceful place in the world. Outside is the cold dead of 3 a.m. on a late November night in Kansas, but inside is lamplight, the warm smell of a newborn, and Adam's wife, Saskia, beautiful Saskia, who a few minutes before had asked her husband if he could watch the baby so she could get a little sleep. "I got it," he had said. "Get some rest." She curled up in the middle of their bed, and the last thing she glimpsed was Adam reclined along the edge, his back against the headboard, and the baby in his arms. He was smiling, as if contentment for this wounded man were possible at last, and she believed it enough to shut her eyes just before he shut his. His arms soon relaxed. His grip loosened. The baby rolled off of his chest and over the edge of the bed, and here came that peaceful moment, the baby in the air, Adam and Saskia asleep, everyone oblivious, the floor still a few inches away, and now, with a crack followed by a thud, the moment is over, and everything that will happen is underway. Saskia is the one who hears it. It is not loud, but it's loud enough. Her eyes fly open. She sees Adam, closed-eyed and emptied-armed, and only when he hears screaming and feels the sharp elbows and knees of someone scrambling across him does he wake up from the sleep he had promised he didn't need. It takes him a second or two. Then he knows what he has done. He says nothing. There's nothing he can say. He is sorry. He is always sorry now. He has been sorry for 2 years, ever since he slunk home from the war. He watches his wife scoop up the baby. He keeps watching, wishing she would look at him, willing her to, always so in need of forgiveness, but she won't. She clutches the crying baby as he dresses and leaves the room. He sits for a while in the dark, listening to her soothe the baby, and then he goes outside, gets into his pickup truck, and positions his shotgun so that it is propped up and pointed at his face. In this way he starts driving, while back in the house, Saskia is trying to understand what happened. A crack. A thud. The thud was the floor, and thank God for the ugly carpet. But what was the crack? The bed frame? The nightstand? This baby, so resilient, breathing evenly. Not even a mark, somehow fine. Maybe he's one of the lucky ones, born to be okay. Saskia lies with him, then gets up and comes back with a plastic bottle of water. She drops it from the side of the bed and listens to the sound it makes as it hits the floor. She drops a pair of heavy shoes and watches them bounce. She finds a basketball and rolls it off the edge. She fills a drink container with enough water to weigh about as much as the baby, and as Adam continues driving and considering the gun, not yet, not yet, not yet, not yet, she rolls that off the edge too. And happily, the book goes on from there. It's as I said, it's the story of the afterwar. You know, since 9/11, about 2.5 million Americans have joined the various services, and of the 2.5 million, about 2 million have been deployed either into Iraq or Afghanistan. Of the 2 million, the best estimates are that 20 to 30% have come home with some type of psychological wound from their experiences. PTSD, maybe TBI, which is traumatic brain injury, which is basically the psychological damage that occurs after your brain is just rattled all to hell. It's, I guess it's worth emphasizing that out of the 2 million, 1.5 million came home okay. And, you know, in many cases, they're better for the experience. But a significant number, 500,000, are said to be not okay, and they're the ones this book is about. It's kind of interesting already. You know, I've gotten a little blowback on the book from people who say that what this book is going to do is perpetuate the stereotype of the bruised and wounded soldier, and I have to tell you, I don't get it, because the fact is, they are wounded. They are broken by their experiences. And while it's not most of the soldiers who were over there, it's a good number of them. And And the ones who are fine, I hope they get their own book someday, but this book is about the ones who aren't fine. My concern is really, these weren't popular wars, and my concern is how to get people to pay attention. So there's a thing at the beginning of the book, as I write toward the beginning of Thank You for Your Service, about the number 500,000. How to grasp the true size of such a number and all of its implications, especially in a country that has paid such scant attention to the wars in the first place. One way would be to imagine the 500,000 in total, perhaps as points on a map of America, all suddenly illuminated at once. The sight would be of a country glowing from coast to coast. And another way would be to imagine them one at a time, starting with the one who is out in the middle of a Kansas night, driving around and around unseen. Toward dawn, he returns home. He doesn't mention to Saskia where he's been or what he had been thinking, and she doesn't ask. Instead, the shotgun is put away, the baby awakens for his next feeding, and a breaking family whose center has become Adam's war wounds gets on with another day of trying to recover, followed by another day after that. I'd like to emphasize the word trying in these sentences because the book, I think, goes into the circumstances these people are facing every day. But what moved me most of all after almost 2 years of living with these people, of being embedded with them, of watching their attempts to heal, is the trying that went on and continued going on now. And it became profound to me and quite moving. The book does not have a point of view. It's a piece of journalism. As I said, I was with them for 18 months. There are no headlines in this book. We all know war is lousy. We all know at some level that recovery from war or trauma is difficult. And there are lots of books out there making these very points. Lots of books on PTSD, statistics, possible causes. This is not that book, those books. This is ground level, intimate, watching a cluster of people get on with the business of trying to get better and trying as hard as humans can try at anything as they do this. I think they agreed to be in this book, and it's painful. It's I don't think it's a difficult read, but it's not the easiest read, and I like to think that the people agreed to be in this book because, first of all, I had some credibility. I'd covered them in the war. I had seen them blow up and die and not die and recover, and so they were familiar with the work I did. But I think they're also hoping that people just, you read these stories and instead of something abstract, these hidden recoveries are a little less hidden, and they become cemented into real, living, breathing, I think, pretty wonderful people. Wars end. The after-war doesn't end, and it's going on right now. I'd like to have some questions in the discussion with you all, but I really like these people, and I just want to tell you about a few more of them before I stop talking. There's a guy in the book named Michael Emery. Michael Emery was on a rooftop at near the beginning of their deployment when a sniper got a clean shot and fired a bullet into his head. And down went Emery on a rooftop. And as it happened, Adam Schumann, one of the reasons Adam Schumann had to leave the war is because he put Michael Emery on his back to get him down 3 flights of stairs. And the blood, much of the blood coming out of Michael Emery's head kept draining into Adam Schumann's mouth as he kind of huffed and puffed his way down the stairs. And 6 months later, well, to this day, but 6 months later, on the day he left, he was still tasting that blood, and he was unable to stop. As for Emery, look, the guy was supposed to die. He didn't. He was supposed to never walk again. He walks. He was supposed to never talk again. He talks. Like his doctor says, he's a walking miracle. And then he revises that. He's an absolute walking phenomenon to those who don't know differently. Michael Emery was shot in the head, and the bullet ruined the part of his brain that regulates such things as emotions and impulse control. He has no sensation on his left side. He can't stand easily. He can't move his left foot or toes. He can't straighten his left arm. He can't wiggle his left fingers. He can't wink his left eye. He is divorced now from Maria, the woman he was married to when he was in the hospital, and who didn't leave his bedside. "I love you, baby," she would say over and over to him in those first days when he couldn't talk and he could barely move. "Her and her damn mouth," is what he says about what happened after that. He has a young daughter who was in the family truck one day when he all of a sudden went haywire, punched the rearview mirror, shattered the windshield. Now the daughter has gone to Texas with her mother, and he is grateful so she doesn't have to grow up around such a man as himself. Before he was shot, he was never angry. Now he can't control it. Now he telephones his daughter every day from a safe distance. "My little giraffe," he calls her. He has a computer he uses to introduce himself to women on dating sites. He is always honest, saying he got injured in the war, and in 6 months there's been one response from someone who wrote back, "Thank you for serving our country." He still has the helmet he was wearing when he was shot, which has the hole where the bullet went in and the hole where the bullet went out, and which he uses every Halloween as a candy bowl. He was suicidal for a while, but he isn't so much anymore. One time when he wasn't yet walking, he tried to tip over his wheelchair, hoping he would bang his head hard enough on the floor to die. One time when Maria was still taking care of him, he asked her to bring him a pencil so he could stab himself in the neck. One time, his last attempt, he tried to bite through his wrists. He's not as angry anymore either, he says, although sometimes he is, and he's not as depressed anymore, although sometimes he is that too. Mostly he is alone, just alone, and sometimes he thinks about how he joined the Army to become a mechanic, and if he hadn't switched jobs, none of this would have happened. So it's no one's fault but his own. "Everybody tells me it's not my fault." "It's not your fault. It's not your fault." "Yes, it is," he says. There's a widow named Amanda Doster who for a time drove everywhere with the box containing her husband's cremated remains buckled into the passenger seat of her car with a seatbelt. There's a soldier named Nick Danino who went to war with a tattoo that said "Unity and Peace," and then he punched his first Iraqi in the face, and then he pushed his first Iraqi down some stairs, and then he was home crying and telling his wife, "I feel like a monster." There's a guy named Tesolo Ayeti, interesting guy, who was in a Humvee that was blown sky high, and a couple of years later had a complete breakdown. I mean, listen, here's the deal on Ayeti. He spent 7 weeks in a PTSD program where he was called a hero, and he was asked to write about what he had done in the war. And he did that. 53 pages about what happened after the boom. This was his therapy. He wrote about the Humvee rising in the air. He wrote about the concussion of the bomb, opening the door and trying to run, collapsing with a broken leg, limping back to the Humvee and pulling out a bloody soldier, pulling out a second one who was moaning and even bloodier as the Humvee sparked and burst into flames, collapsing again, relieved that everyone was out, and then hearing someone yelling Harrelson's name. And it hit me, oh shit, Harrelson. I forgot all about him, he had written. I looked over and all I could see was flames and the outline of a body where he was at in the driver's seat. Over and over he had written about it all, except for one thing that he has told no one, a dream he's been having ever since. Harrelson on fire, asking him, "Why didn't you save me?" There's a guy named Tim Jung. Tim Jung was one of the people in charge of the new arrivals at the WTB, the Warrior Transition Battalion. This is the place where the wounded were specifically sent to try to recover from what had happened to them. The wide-eyed, the nervous-eyed, the closed-eyed, the dead-eyed, they all start out with Tim Jung, a friendly, gum-chewing, boyish-looking sergeant first class who one day, without telling anyone, goes for a drive by himself into the Kansas countryside. 15 miles from the WTB, he pulls into a dirt parking area next to the Big Blue River. It's late afternoon, and not many people are around. But just to be sure he won't be interrupted, he decides to go to the far side of the river. He climbs an embankment and starts across a train trestle. If a train comes, there won't be much he can do, but at this point it hardly matters. He has plenty of sleeping pills with him and blank paper on which to write letters to his children. His plan is simple. Write the letters, swallow the pills, wade into the river, and let the water take it from there. It's hard to say what has brought him to this point. Probably, like so many cases he's seen at the WTB, it's not one thing in particular, but an accumulation of everything. On the far side now, no train. He'll have to do it himself. He walks south along the river's edge until he finds a place to sit. The air has that damp, moldy smell of mud and ripe leaves, but he doesn't mind it. He takes out the paper and pen and wonders in his life's last moments what to write of all that has happened. A life of soldiering, a long marriage that failed, a period of cancer treatments. Any one of them could be its own letter, but what he chooses instead for his final words are the thoughts of a father who is proud of his children and knows absolutely that they will go on to accomplish great things. He writes for a while in the stink of the river until he is sure he has written something okay for his children to read and reread in a lifetime of trying to drown out the noise of what he's about to do. And then he gets the pills ready and takes a look around the spot he's chosen. He's looking west into a setting sun that seems to be lighting the river on fire. It is beautiful, he allows himself to think. And as he keeps looking, he takes notice of the river's current, which strikes him as beautiful too. He watches some water bugs skimming along the surface and some birds riding the late afternoon drafts. There are crickets also, pining away in the grasses, and weeds. And whereas a few minutes before he was hearing and seeing none of this, now he sits with pills in hand and letters next to him, transfixed. The crickets keep singing. The water keeps moving. The sun keeps dropping. It's beautiful, he keeps thinking. And in that little bit of hesitation, something inside of him turns or recedes or cracks open or does whatever happens when someone no longer wants to die, because when he at last stands up, it is to go gratefully, away from the river, back across the trestle, back home to hide the letters in a desk drawer, and back to the WTB, where the new arrivals keep coming and coming and coming, all of them headed to the river. So, who are these soldiers? The 500,000 headed to the river? Well, as I write in the book, they are the ones home from a war where every day would begin the same way. The soldiers would tuck Lucky Charms into their pockets and joke about their final words. They would gather in quick circles to pray and smoke the last cigarette of their lives. They would tighten their body armor, push in their earplugs, lower their shadow-resistant sunglasses, and tug on their burn-resistant gloves. And when someone called out, "Let's go," they would climb into their Humvees and go, knowing full well what was waiting for them down the road. They had seen Harrelson's Humvee rise into the air and burst into fire. They had seen Emery get shot in the head and collapse in his own spreading blood. They had seen soldiers lose legs, lose arms, lose feet, lose hands, lose fingers, lose toes, and lose eyes, and they had heard them too in the aid station in whatever pain is enough pain to make a 19-year-old scream. They had heard a soldier ask, "Is anything sticking out of my head?" after a mortar attack. They had heard a doctor say, I'm hoping, about a soldier who in a few minutes would be dead. They had heard a soldier tell a dying soldier, as he stuffed what was left of him into a Humvee, "You're going to have to move your feet so I can close the door." They had heard a soldier who had lost his right leg and right arm and most of his left arm saying, "Ow, it hurts, it hurts." They had heard a sergeant who was watching something skid across the floor of the aid station, which had fallen from a shredded soldier who was about to die, say with sadness, "That's a toe." Most of all, they had heard explosion after explosion and seen dozens of Humvees disappear into breathtaking clouds of fire and debris. And by the end, most of them had been inside such a cloud themselves, blindly feeling around in those initial moments to determine if they were alive or dead or intact or in pieces as their ears rang and their hearts galloped and their souls darkened and their eyes occasionally filled with tears. So they knew. And yet day after day, they would go out anyway, which eventually came to be what the war was about. Not winning, not losing, nothing so grand, just trying and then trying again until it was time to go home and discovering that life after the war would be very much the same. So goes the book. And I should point out that the title isn't meant to be judgmental, ironic, sarcastic, nothing like that. It's simpler. You read the book, and these are some of the people you're thanking, and these are some of the things you're thanking them for. one last story. What happened after I drank Adam Schumann's pee, and the trip went on and neared its end. Saskia is driving. They fight in eastern Colorado. They make up. They fight again in western Kansas. They make up again. A car won't get out of the way. She gets close. It won't move. She gets closer. It still won't move. She honks her horn. It still won't move. She is so close she can read the bumper sticker. Pray for our troops, it says. Now the car moves over and Saskia guns it. They're almost home. And now they're home. And Ayetti, the Schumanns, the Dosters, the whole cast of characters. The war in Iraq may be over, but the afterwar goes on. So on that happy note, I hope there's some questions.
I was a physician at Bethesda Naval Hospital.
Okay.
So I saw, not a surgeon, but I saw a fair number of these. My question is about whether the Iraq War and the Afghan War are different. My generation was Vietnam. It was our generation that sort of invented PTSD. My father was in the infantry, drafted in the infantry in World War II. He was in the Battle of the Bulge as a private, cannon fodder. And yet lots of those men came home. Some had terrible problems, but some of them did all right. I mean, regardless of the awful stuff, just as bad as Iraq, and in some cases much worse. What do you think you think there is a difference, and do you think it's because there's no draft?
No,
Most people aren't involved. These people are
I know what
volunteers.
you're asking, and it's unanswerable.
Right.
But so here's what I can point out. Before these wars, when people came home, as recent as Vietnam, there was no system to take care of them.
That's true.
So that's a difference. The difference, I guess, is in methods of recovery. And now it's an overwhelmed system, but there is some attempt. If somebody steps forward, has the courage to finally say, I'm kind of screwed up and I need some help. There is a system, haphazard, awkward, overwhelmed, inefficient, insufficient, but at least there's a system to try to steer them towards some help. That didn't happen before. Statistics are better now. The Army is keeping careful track, the military is keeping careful track of suicide rates. That didn't happen before. But here's the common sense part, and I think it's borne out by anecdotes in the book. One of the people in the book is a great woman who's now the Surgeon General of the Army, and her father fought heroically in several wars. And when I met her, her father had come with her to live, and he was not able to communicate very well. And every day and every night began with him screaming about something he was seeing, even though he had never acted out. I guess what I'm saying is, whether it's in these wars, previous wars, or something that has nothing to do with war, when something happens in life that shakes you down to your bones, that's where the commonality is. The difference might be in recovery, but I have to think, based on conversations and my own reporting and what I've seen, that when you're messed up no matter when it is, what war or what non-war. It's a great question, and I wish I could answer it specifically.
Well, thank you.
All right. Anybody else?
Hello. I just want to know what happened. How is Adam Schumann and his wife now? Are they still together?
No. After I finished reporting the book, they reached the point where they just couldn't do it anymore, and so they live near each other, but they're apart from each other, and they're making progress. Everybody I write about, this is not a hopeless book. it would be hopeless, I guess, if everyone stopped trying. And they're all in their own ways trying to get better, including the Schumans. But while wars end, recovery is open-ended, and
I have another question.
on they
then.
go.
So, do
Yeah.
you, of the people that seem like they're trying and getting a little bit better,
Yeah.
is there any commonness among them, like a supportive family or a family that can
No.
help them or anything?
No, that's what makes it so hard for the folks trying to heal these guys. There aren't perfect patterns. There aren't perfect methods to make someone better. And because, I mean, it gets down to the question, look, you have two people standing side by side. The same thing happens. The same traumatizing event happens at the same moment to both of them. And one is hobbled for the rest of his life, and one, it's tough for a while, but absorbs it, moves on, gets better. And so one of the things you see in this book is you see Tesolo Ayeti, the guy whose Humvee was blown sky high. And look, I got to write about Ayeti because the day it happened, the day his Humvee went in the air, I was not in that convoy, but I was at the aid station. And when these 4 wounded guys were brought in, and so I stood with Ayeti, who I hadn't known, but I just stood with him while he was being treated. And then I was with him when he found out that Harrelson had died. And there's just this look on his face that I'll forever see. And anyway, he starts having these dreams about Harrelson. And then a year or so into it, he destroys his apartment and has to be put in a program. So he ends up about an hour away from the apartment in Topeka. There's a VA hospital. They have a PTSD program, and that's where Ayeti ends up, in a 7-week program, inpatient program for PTSD. Nick Danino, the guy with the tattoo, the guy who came home feeling like a monster, after a couple of suicide attempts, it was. I mean, he had to go somewhere. He had to get help. Topeka would have been nice, but the waiting list for Topeka was huge, and he needed help right then. So they looked around and they found a program for him in Pueblo, Colorado that was not VA. It was insurance supported. It's a program with a good reputation. It's not 7 weeks, it's 4 weeks. Did Danino go to that program because it was more suited to his problems? No, he went there because they had an opening and he needed to go somewhere, so that's what he got. Adam Schumann, the main guy I write about in this book, the great soldier who came home so filled with shame, he finally reached the point where he acknowledged needing help. Topeka, full. Pueblo, full. So he had a caseworker who looked around and finally found this obscure, dinky little program in Northern California that had an opening. That program, which is donor supported, minimum 4 months. Lucky Schumann, by the luck of the draw, got to go to a program where he wasn't booted out after 4 weeks or 7 weeks, but it was minimum 4 months, and he could stay as long as he wanted. And Adam Schumann will tell you to this day, the fact that he got to that program and got to stay and tear his life apart and figure out what in the world was wrong with him, he's alive because of it. He's not perfect by any means, but he's not trying to kill himself anymore. I was just talking to him the other day. He had gone fishing, and there was a guy. Oh my God! He said, "Well, I almost ended up in jail today." I said, "What's going on, man?" He said, "I was fishing. Nobody's around. I'm by myself. One other guy shows up. Anywhere he could be. What does he do? He stands 3 feet away from me and starts casting his line in my line. And he was drunk, and he had a kid with him. And I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "You want to get in a fight?" And Adam said, "I wanted to fight him so bad. I mean, I could have beaten him to a pulp. But, I thought of the program. I thought of the tools I learned. And it's weird. I walked away. I just packed up and went away." To me, this is a great victory. And And also that poor kid who was watching got to see what an adult acts like, and kind of a nice story in its very American way. Anybody else? Hi. Hi, I'm sorry.
No problem.
Microphones everywhere.
I was wondering if you saw a difference in those who are active duty who stayed in active duty and those who went into the veterans system. Did you see any difference in the recovery?
No, but again, this is a pretty small sample, and I mean, I'm not writing a study. I'm writing a book, and so if I decided to write a book about the afterwar, well, there are a lot of people who were in the afterwar, but I decided to stick with the guys I knew from the good soldiers, and I keep saying guys because it was an infantry battalion, and everyone was a guy. So that means that although this book thankfully has women in it, strong, interesting women, they tend to be wives and widows and mothers and girlfriends. They're not women who served. So these guys were active, and then they got out and they went into the VA system. VA system is pretty tough to penetrate when you're trying to do reporting. The closest I got is one of the things I do in the book. Another guy I write about is a guy named Pete Corelli, 4-star general. He helped run the Iraq War for a while. Then he came back to D.C., was promoted to vice chief of the Army. And one of the portfolios he was given was to try to figure out mental health issues and suicides in particular. So what Corelli started doing, I mean, if anybody here knows him, he's a fascinating, complicated soul, and you give him something, he just focuses and obsesses on it, and the guy's full of passion. And he began doing these monthly meetings at the Pentagon, where there would be maybe 20 or so people in the room, and then there would be video link-ups to posts around the world. And the point was to go over suicides. 2-hour meeting. Everybody where a suicide had occurred had 5 minutes to explain, here's what happened, and here are the lessons we learned from it. 5 minutes for lessons learned. And they kept it to 5 minutes because there were so many suicides that even with a 2-hour meeting, they often didn't have enough time to keep up with all the ones they were trying to get to on a particular day. I thought that was a great effort by Corelli. He went into it. I know I'm wandering away from your question, but I want to talk about this guy. He went into it saying, we have got to change the culture of the Army. And I think by the end of it, 3 years later, he would acknowledge, no, he didn't. No one changes the culture. The Army's huge. But I think he likes to think that maybe he influenced a few people under him, who influenced a few people under them, and down it went to the line, to the ground level where this book is based, and it might have some effect person by person. But to get back to what you were asking, from what I saw and what from these people described, whether you're getting help in a WTB that the Army set up, or a VA hospital, or a vet center, where Adam Schuman screwed up the courage to go in and say he needed help. And, talk about the collision of good intentions and absurdity. I mean, he's feeling like a hang dog anyway. But he goes into this vet center, pretty good vet center, and he's sitting across from a woman who her job that day is to do an intake. Has forms in front of her. And gets to the point, she's filling out the form, and she says, so how many deployments have you had? And he said, well, 3, and I think the third one is what broke me, and when I started thinking of ending my life. That's a great thing, for him to say that much. It was such an opening, but that's not what she was up to at that moment, not to provide therapy, just to figure out the best course of therapy. And she said, I'm sorry, how many deployments? Yeah. And you could just see Schuman just stop. And he finished the appointment, and we walked outside, and forgive the language, he just said, fuck this, I'm done. I'm done asking for help. Now, eventually he did again. But it's just that little chance, that little intersection where there are good intentions. So much can go wrong with this population because whether you're heroic Aieti or monster feeling Danino or somebody in between, the fact is, what's going on inside of you, the common thing is guilt over something, a sense of shame over something, and the openings for healing are few and far between. And from what I saw, whether VA, WTBs, good intentions, and day to day, it was just a mess, and sometimes not in a funny way. Hi, shorter answer coming.
I remember asking you this question after your first book. I was curious as to whether you knew of anybody trying to do something like what you were doing on the Iraqi side to chronicle that side of it. And this 4 years have gone by. I'm just wondering if maybe there's something that's happening on that side. I
hope. I mean, I'd like to read that book. I'd like to read that story, but I haven't seen it yet. If anybody has, I'd like to know what the book is. You know, at the beginning of the war, an old friend, Anthony Shadid, did great work for the Washington Post. He was inside Iraq, and he wrote brilliantly about what was happening in those corners in a way that nobody else wrote. And so you got to see it. So Anthony Shadid did that, and he wrote a great book, kept covering wars, lost his life. And so it would be nice to have Shadid in there, but I don't know anybody else who's doing it. I can't. You know, I wish I could, but I don't have those moves or skills. So the answer is I don't know of anyone. Hi.
Hi. I wanted to follow up on your mention of women in the book.
Okay.
Could you reflect a little on the experience of meeting these guys, as you said, in what I am guessing was an almost exclusively male environment in the war zone, and then coming home and seeing them with wives, mothers, daughters, women?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So let me see if I can answer it right. Okay, so the first book was about guys at war, and the second book is about families, really, families trying to heal from the war. And in the first book, you know, the way this widow I described earlier, her name is Amanda Doster, and the way she showed up in the first book was after her husband James was killed. A few days later, the battalion commander called to the Doster house on, I think they were living on Liberty Lane in Kansas. And so I heard his side of the conversation. I heard him talk to her, express condolences, hang up, and just say, that may be the saddest woman I've talked to yet. That's all I knew of Amanda Doster. But when this book started, I was so glad for the opportunity to write about women as well as men, and I really wanted to write about Amanda Doster. And so there are several chapters devoted to her and what she's going through with her kids, and you know, it's pretty tough stuff. It's also strong stuff. I mean, she's good. Adam and Saskia, I mean, what went on between them? It was just so hard to watch. And my style of reporting is not to interview; it's just to go along. So all these fights they're having, and the tailgating she does, and the screaming back and forth. I mean, they're in the front seat, and I'm kind of hiding in the back seats, taking notes on what's going on. And Saskia, of all the people I write about in the book, I think Saskia may be the most complicated of all. She is so angry over what happened. And, you know, just like at the beginning of the war, these guys went into it really thinking they might know what is about to happen. But of course, none of them knew what was about to happen. And now they're home, and it's a version of the same thing. The families have no idea what happened or what's happening day to day. These are the lives being led, and not just in this little cluster I write about, but in clusters like this across the country. The lives being led are, in many cases, out of control lives. It's lives of reaction to something that began with the best of intentions and has gone so wildly out of control. And so you see these people, like I said, trying to claw their way back to some sense of normalcy or control or getting on with it. And to see these guys over there, the guys I was with, they didn't talk about women in a way you might assume. At least the ones I was with, they were hurt by affairs and things like that, but women didn't seem to be objectified in any way. These were not degrading conversations. But to see them back and to see how dependent and reliant they want to be on women, but at the same time how isolated they are, that's a really interesting dichotomy and dynamic to watch. There's a line in the book that if the truth of war is that you're in it for the guy next to you, the truth of the after war is you're pretty much on your own. And all of these people, even when they're connected, are quite lonely as they go through this. Sure.
What would you like to see change as a result of your book, or what do you think could change?
Oh, okay. So I'm not naive enough to think that a book I've written is going to have any effect on policy, on war policies. I mean, war is, war was, war will be. I guess. So let me give a mild answer. I guess the hope here is that, if people read this book, they'll have some. What is so filled with numbing numbers that don't make sense. Oh, the suicide rate is going up every month. Oh, we have 500,000 people with psychological wounds. This number, it's meaningless. Big numbers. To my mind, if you read this book and you kind of feel for these characters, and you have them in mind as you read these statistics, that's a pretty good accomplishment. And I think to hope for any more would be ludicrous on my part.
David, I have a question about reporting craft, and
Okay.
you started to touch on this in the answer to the question before last when you said that your approach is basically to sort of go along. But now, you've had these two experiences embedding with the same people, but in two very different environments. And I'm just wondering how your reporting techniques and approaches were the same or differed between the battlefield and the home front.
It's pretty much the same, and I wish I had different moves, but it's the only one I have is to show up and to stay long enough that interviewing ends, conversations begin and conversations end, and I'm just kind of along for the ride. It sounds a little corny, the old fly on the wall thing, but I think I felt pretty lucky to be the one to go to Iraq and write about that particular corner of the war. Not the high altitude book. And God knows there are great books out there. I'm not diminishing those books, but they had been out by the time I started The Good Soldiers, and memoirs were coming out, but no one had really documented the low level corner. That was the soldiers' corner, the not policy, but the effects of policy, and just to see what happens. The intent was to not write about war, but to use war to write about the character of young men who were sent into this war at that particular moment, to see what happened to them. So the danger is that I visit the story and then after a week think I know enough to write a smart story about what these soldiers are feeling. And that's nonsense. It takes me a long time to reach a level of confidence that what I'm writing about conveys the soldier's story rather than my own developing emotions, if that makes sense. So, and it's the same thing on this one. That was scary as hell, man. I mean, I came home. This was tough, and I'm not comparing myself with soldiers. I'm just saying that when I came home, I was pretty shaken by the experience, and then this one it's a whole different thing, because this was not physically frightening, but these people. I mean, in front of me now, the thing I'm embedded with, the thing I'm witnessing is people in many cases simply trying to stay alive, down to survival mode, figuring out how, not even thinking of the next day, thinking of the next 5 minutes, thinking of in the smallest increments, how do I get through this? And so this is a weird position for a journalist. It's because I'm not an ass. I'm a feeling human being. I care about these people. They're falling apart in front of me. And here I am, same old guy with the notebook and the tape recorder taking notes on them falling apart. But that's the deal, and they knew it, and they were accepting of it, and I was pretty true to it, except for one occasion. I think I did the right thing. There was a point when Adam Schumann, I wasn't there for this, but I was back here doing some reporting on Pete Corelli, the general, and in the middle of a dinner, I started getting texts from Saskia saying, well, this shit's really hitting the fan. And as soon as I could, I called her and said, what's going on? And she said, well, a little while ago, Adam was down in the basement and with a gun under his chin, and I had to wrestle it away from him. And she just went on. It was serious, and it was horrible. So I went out the next day, and Adam was uncommunicative. He was away. So I spent time with Saskia, and she was telling me, we went through it. Let's walk through it. Tell me again what happened, so that as I'm writing about it, I can write about it with some authority. Place a reader there, that kind of thing. And we went through it. Then a few days later, I was with Adam. He was out fishing. I was with him. And I said, look, man, I got to hear about what happened the other day. He said, all right, okay. So we sat there, and he walked me through it. And then he went through it again. He'd do all the reporting things where you hear the story several times. And it became so clear to me that like even though there's always a signal, I'm a reporter here, man. I'm not your therapist. I'm not your priest. I'm taking notes. I'm writing a book. Nonetheless, I had become, for Adam Schumann, one of the few people he talks to. So, and he was in serious jeopardy, obviously. So, I put the notebook down and said, so I need to talk to you. And I said something like, you really need to get help. Talked for a bit, picked up the notebook and continued. But I realized, in that moment, if he had said, okay, you're right, I need to get help, and he had gone to get help, the book's basically over. Because then you always interfere a little bit. You have some effect. But this was direct interference. This was me saying, you go get help. And if he had gone to get help right then, it changes everything. I can't write the book I was writing. The book would have been over at that point. He didn't get help then. Eventually he did. And so the book continued. But it's just a strange role. It's just a strange role to be present for these people going through the worst things imaginable. And they want to talk to me, and I want to hear everything. And in the end, I'm sticking to the book. And now, how weird is this? Because the book's been out for 4 or 5 days. I get to move on. I don't know if any of them will be in a book again. So here's this book that will last however long books last. And it's the story of these people at their worst moments. And they get to have that forever. That's a little creepy.
Time for one more.
Yeah, hi.
Hi. I know you were with them at first, and I was just wondering, how are you now, and how are you dealing with? I know you. I'm guessing you saw a lot of stuff. How are you dealing with that kind of stuff?
Yeah, no, I'm okay. I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and sort of came up with a new version of an answer. Because this person was saying that he thought this whole idea of talk therapy, where you revisit an event, which is a cornerstone of much of the cognitive processing therapy these guys are going through. he was saying he thought that was nonsense. And I wasn't arguing with him, but it got me thinking about my own experiences. And my own experiences, I came home from that war. I came home from this version of the afterwar. And I basically have written about their bad days again and again, trying to make narrative sense of it, developed from chronology into narrative. And you know, I'm fine. And I think one of the reasons I'm fine after all these rattling things is because I sort of went through a version of that, just basically revisiting the event again, or events again and again, not to numb it, but to feel it in appropriate way so I could write it. That was quite, I think if I can be goofy about it, cathartic and ultimately healing. And so, I mean, I haven't gone through CPT, but it sort of makes me think I can see why it might work for people. Anything else? Okay, look, before you go, I swear, it's not all this depressing. It's I'm just in a mood tonight, you know. It's the weather's changing and the rain was tough, and you know, these are wonderful people, and I'm glad I got to talk about them. So thank you very much.